What's up guys, welcome back, and today as promised we're going to be reviewing all the Chaos characters in Warhammer Tacticus. Alright, so let's just jump right into it. The first faction we're going to be looking at is the Black Legion, which is used in the Fall Acadia campaign, and their faction passive is Let the Galaxy Burn, which anytime they attack a non-Chaos unit they have a 50% chance of scoring an additional hit. And the first character we're looking at is Angrax, who's really powerful. His passives are Deep Strike, which lets you teleport to any hex at the start of the battle that isn't adjacent to an enemy unit, and Terminator Armor. So the first hit he takes each turn deals minus 75% damage. And what makes Angrax such a powerful character is his passive ability. So anytime he comes into melee contact with an enemy, he deals additional damage, and whenever an adjacent enemy moves, they immediately take damage from Angrax. What makes this so strong is that in game modes like Onslaught and Legendary Release events, there are spawn points on the map where the enemies will spawn each turn, and if you just park Angrax at one of those spawn points, he will damage every single enemy that comes out of that spawn point every single turn. So you can completely lock down up one or two spawn points just with Angrax alone. His active ability is also pretty decent. It's just like a mild melee AoE, and his basic attack is a 4-hit power melee hit. So overall, Angrax is a super tanky unit and super useful in a ton of different game modes, as well as the campaign, so I would definitely recommend focusing on him, and especially his passive ability. And as a ranking, I would definitely put him in the S tier. He's a really great character, and I definitely recommend putting some time into him. The next character we're going to be looking at is Volk. His passives are Big Target, so adjacent allies take -1 hit from ranged attacks, and Demon, so he's an extra % chance to block damage, and Suppressive Fire. So enemy units hit by his ranged attacks are suppressed, meaning they deal less damage, have -1 movement, and can't go into Overwatch. Volk is a glass cannon character, so he's not that great. He's more of a liability in game modes like Campaign, where you're trying to get the 3-star, and I wouldn't recommend leveling up for that. He does have some niche uses, such as in the Guild Raids game mode as a ranged damage dealer, but there are still other units that outshine him there, such as Thaddeus, Mugen Ra, and Rivas if you have those. If you do want to focus on this guy, although I wouldn't recommend it, I would focus leveling up his passive, which gives you a % chance of adding additional hits to his ranged attacks. Meanwhile, his active is just a widespread ranged AoE, which is not that useful in guild raids. But overall, I would rank him probably in like the C tier. He does do a lot of damage with his ranged attacks, but he is super squishy, and there are better units for his purpose. The next character I'm going to be looking at is Archimados, who's a Psyker. So anytime he deals damage with a ranged attack, he also has a 50% chance of dealing damage to a random enemy adjacent to his target. His passive is Possession, so anytime he defeats an enemy, he spawns a Bloodletter in its hex. And his active is Incursion, which summons a Bloodletter adjacent to a target that immediately attacks the target, and it will repeat this until either the target dies or is completely surrounded. Overall, Archimados is a super strong character. I would definitely put him in the S tier, and he's the one I would recommend the most focusing on for beating the campaign. He's also useful in a ton of different game modes. His passive is really useful for cleaning up weaker units and getting summons, and his active is really useful for completely surrounding strong units and getting a ton of summons out at once. So he also has uses with his active in modes such as guild raids, and he's also useful when paired up with other characters such as Commissar Yarrick, and as well as Abraxas, who's another Chaos unit I'll be looking at soon. So I definitely wouldn't neglect this guy, and I would focus on leveling both his passive and active abilities. Next is Harkin. He has the passive Flying, which lets him pass through impassable hexes. His active ability does a ton of melee damage and reduces enemies' armor, as well as triggers the Battle Fatigue trait, which is useful in the campaign against Acadian Guardsmen. His passive lets him deal additional damage and gain an additional hit for his melee attacks every time he defeats an enemy unit. And his melee attack is really strong and has a really high pierce ratio. So overall, I would rank him around the B tier. He's very useful in the campaign and has a couple of fringe uses outside of that, such as in guild raids against the Rogel Dorn battle tank. But otherwise, he's not that useful of a character, and I wouldn't recommend focusing on this guy too much. Pretty much just get him up to where you need him to be to clear the campaign. The last character is the legendary Abaddon. His passives are Terminator Armor and Resilient, so anytime he takes lethal damage, he gets reduced down to 1 health instead. His passive ability buffs the damage of surrounding Chaos units, and also increases the faction passive of the Black Legion up to 2 hits. His active ability does 8 hits and a ton of damage, but also reduces his own health. Overall, Abaddon's a decent character. I would rank him between the B and C tiers. He's not that useful in any particular game mode and isn't as good as some of the other characters we just looked at, but he does have his uses, such as in legendary release events where his traits are super useful for gaining points. Our next faction is the Death Guard, and their faction passive is Contagions of Nurgle, which basically just reduces the armor of surrounding enemy units. Our first character is Malladus, and his traits are Terminator Armor and Resilient. His passive ability basically just makes it so that when he defeats an enemy with his normal attack, he also damages an additional unit adjacent to both him and his original target. And his active ability is basically just a buffed up version of his normal attack. Overall, Malladus is a super strong unit. His movement is pretty weak, which makes him pretty slow, but he's super tanky, and just with his normal attack alone, he can clear up to 3 enemies per turn. This makes him a super useful character, especially in legendary release events and Onslaught, where you fight against waves and waves of enemies, and I would definitely recommend focusing on this guy. For focusing on him, I would upgrade his rank the most, because you just want to increase his damage stat for his normal attack as much as possible. Our next character is Nauseous Rotbone, and he has the traits Resilient as well as Healer, which means he could heal a friendly unit as his action each turn. His passive lets him revive a friendly chaos unit that dies adjacent to him each turn. And his active is basically just an AoE heal that doesn't affect Imperials and double heals for chaos. Overall, this character is really amazing as he's the only chaos healer, and I would definitely put him in the S tier. He's probably the most useful character in the entire game in legendary events and can also be really useful in 3-starring the campaign. To focus on this guy, I would focus the most on his rank, as his normal heal ability is the most important, and this scales based on his number of hits and his damage. Our next character is Postillion, and he has the traits Resilient as well as Putrid Explosions. Whenever he dies, he'll do 25% of his max health to all adjacent units. His passive buffs ranged attacks with blast damage, and his active buffs melee attacks with direct damage. Overall, this character is pretty weak right now, and I wouldn't recommend focusing on him. I'd probably put him in the F tier right now. He's not that useful, and his buffs aren't that big that make him worth picking over any of the other characters. So I would definitely avoid this guy if possible. Next is Corodius, and he just has the Resilient trait. His passive ability makes it so that friendly Chaos units gain +1 movement, and the enemy Psykered units damage themselves anytime they deal psychic damage. His active ability just has a chance to spawn Poxwalkers. Overall, Corodius is kind of a decent unit. I would put him around the C tier. He is useful mostly for his passive that buffs the movement of Chaos units, because the Death Guard faction only have 2 movement, so he's useful in tandem with like Malladus and Rotbone to give them extra movement so they could kill enemies faster. But by himself, he's not really that useful, and his basic attack is also pretty weak, only being a single hit. So I wouldn't recommend focusing on this guy too much, but if you do want to use him, he is an okay unit that can slot into teams with Malladus and Rotbone. Last is Typhus, the legendary. He has a Terminator Armor, Psyker, and Resilient traits. His passive ability just does direct damage to an adjacent enemy at the start of his turn. And his active ability does a ton of psychic AoE damage. It damages the initial target, then all enemies adjacent to that target, and then all enemies adjacent to those targets. Overall, Typhus is a pretty decent character. I would put him between the B and C tier, more leaning towards the B tier. He is really good with his active ability that can clear a ton of units at once, but he doesn't really have that many uses in a bunch of different game modes. And if you're lucky enough to get this guy, I would definitely recommend just focusing on his active, as his passive ability isn't really that good. He's also decently tanky, so he does have some uses in things such as legendary events, but he's not quite as good as some of the other characters like Nauseous, Rotbone, and Malladus. Our next faction is the Thousand Suns, which is used in the Samhain Mirror campaign. Their faction passive is Weaver of Fates, so if 3 or more enemy units have taken psychic damage, they'll deal the maximum possible damage with their attacks that turn. Our first character is Abraxas, who's a Psyker. His passive ability makes it so that friendly Chaos units deal an additional psychic damage with their normal ranged attacks. And his active ability summons a Pink Horror, and then until the end of the turn, anytime an enemy is dealt psychic damage, he'll also summon a Screamer and an adjacent Hex. Overall, Abraxas is an insane unit. I would definitely put him in the S tier, and he's probably the strongest Chaos character in the entire game. That's because of his active ability, where you could pump out a ton of summons in a single turn that all do a bunch of damage. So overall, I would definitely recommend focusing on Abraxas, and especially prioritizing his active ability. Our next character is Yazagor, who has the flying trait. His passive ability basically just buffs himself based on the number of enemy units that have taken psychic damage this turn. His active ability allows him to swap places with a friendly psyker. Overall, by himself, Yazagor is a super weak character, but in tandem with Abraxas, he can become super powerful because after Abraxas uses up all his adjacent hexes for summons, Yazagor can swap places with him and allow him to summon another full round of Screamers. So overall, I wouldn't recommend focusing on Yazagor too much. I would just get him to a point where he can survive long enough to use his active ability to reset Abraxas. Our next character is Toph, and he has the suppressive fire and Terminator armor traits. His passive ability basically just heals him at the start of every turn, and his active ability deals range damage to every enemy unit that's taken psychic damage this turn. Overall, Toph is a decent character. I would probably put him between the B and C tiers, probably leaning towards C. His main use is just to be tanky and heal himself each turn and stay alive with his passive, but he doesn't really dish out a lot of damage, and he doesn't do psychic damage on his own, so he's not as useful with Abraxas. Our next character is Thalmachus, and he has the flying and psyker traits. His passive ability gives a shield to the closest friendly unit every turn, and his active ability allows you to take control of an enemy for one turn. Overall, Thalmachus is another really weak character. I'd also put him in the F tier with Postilion. I would not recommend focusing on him at all. His passive ability seems decent, but doesn't give enough health to be super useful. And his active ability pretty much does nothing every turn. So I would try to avoid Thalmachus, as even though he's an epic character, he's really weak compared to the other Thousand Suns. The last character is the legendary Ahriman. He has the flying and psyker traits. His passive ability makes it so that enemies in fire hexes take additional damage. And his active ability does psychic damage to all enemies within 2 hexes. Overall, Ahriman's a pretty okay character. I'd put him in the same rank as someone like Abaddon. He has his uses, but he's not like super important like Abraxas. If you have this guy, I would recommend focusing on his active, as his passive isn't that useful as there aren't that many units that cause fire hexes. Our last faction is the World Eaters, and they're the newest faction with only 2 units out right now. Their faction passive is Blessings of Khorne, so they deal more damage and take less psychic damage for each unit killed in melee. Our first character is Rask, and he has the traits Terminator Armor, Deep Strike, and Rapid Assault, so he gains +1 movement until he makes a melee attack. His passive ability makes it so that whenever he defeats an enemy, him and an adjacent friendly chaos unit both gain a shield for 1 turn. And his active ability does a bunch of melee damage to a bunch of adjacent enemy units. Overall, Rask is a pretty underwhelming character right now, so I wouldn't recommend on focusing on him, but I still would hold off until the rest of the World Eaters are released, because one of those characters might end up making him a lot better. Our next World Eater character is Macer, who has the Resilient trait. His passive ability makes it so that he deals more damage the lower his health is, and his active ability does a ton of damage to adjacent enemies while also making him lose some of his current health. Overall, Macer also seems a bit underwhelming at the moment. He can dish out a lot of damage, but it's at the cost of his own health, and for a lot of different game modes, it's important for your characters to stay alive until the end to be able to reap all the rewards. So right now, I also wouldn't recommend on focusing Macer, but I still would hold out until the rest of the World Eaters get released, and maybe these 2 characters will be a lot better. Alright, so that's it for all the Chaos units currently in the game. Thanks for watching, and if you want to stay tuned, in my next video, I'm going to be going through all the Xenos units. And if you want to thank me and help me out for making this video, be sure to use my referral code right here, and I'll see you guys soon.